All right, here we are, live and on the road. I'm here with Lew Porchiazzo. Lew, I'm so excited to have you on. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on and to chat with you today.
Oh, yes, trust me, the pleasure is all mine. And I think that people are hankering for some of your knowledge. I think I'm selfishly ready to learn a bunch from you. But I think we are, as we'll talk about, we're in a very unique and in half of the light is a little saddening part of gymnastics, but in the other half is an opportunity for a lot of change and a lot of growth, which I think you in the strength conditioning field in general and a lot of strength conditioning coaches are kind of on the solution side of. So yeah, looking forward to digging into some of this.
Yeah, likewise. Likewise. I think it'll be a good conversation and hopefully valuable for anyone that's listening to this.
I'm sure, absolutely. So, you are the head strength conditioning coach for Michigan Gymnastics, and so I guess let's just start by giving people a little bit of context about, I guess first, how did you get to Michigan, and then kind of what are your roles and what are your duties? Because I think a lot of people who are in the gymnastics world are unfamiliar that strength and conditioning, especially as a full time career and a job. And so, I guess let's just give a little bit of context around what you do every day.
Yeah, sure. So actually next month will be my the start of my 12th year at Michigan. So I've been at Michigan since August of 2009. It's been really really fun time for me. I've grown a lot. I started at U of M as a graduate assistant. I had previously worked at Baylor University as an intern, and then prior to that, U.S. Olympic Committee in Colorado Springs. A little bit of kind of varied background until I got to Michigan, and prior to that, I did my undergrad at William Patterson University of New Jersey. It's a Division III state school where I played football. So, kind of growing up as an athlete myself and somebody that appreciated the training side, that's what drew me to my profession. I'm undersized. I'm about 5'6". I was an
Same.
offensive I was an offensive lineman, so I was about as wide as I am tall, which is really impressive skill. But I realized that my ability to compete and to hang with guys much larger than me was my strength and my commitment to training. So once I saw that as a potential career path, I pursued exercise science as a major
Mm.
and kind of set off on that path to the Olympic Committee and ultimately to Michigan, where I've grown over the last dozen or so years, which is kind of hard to wrap my head around. But so I've been with gymnastics since I started in 2009. I work with the women's team in varying capacities over the course of the last 12 years, and obviously as the years go by, there's tweaks and modifications to the program, and each year is slightly different than the next based on just a variety of different factors. But it's been a fun opportunity for me to learn a lot about a sport that I appreciated uh, every 4 years, a lot like most casual fans are. My earliest memories being Carrie Strug and uh, Dominique Dawes and Dominique Moceanu, and seeing those guys in the '96 Olympics as a 10-year-old kid. I never could have imagined that I'd get to work with gymnasts at the level that I get to work with them over the last decade plus. So really fortunate in the opportunity, and I do work with some other sports as well. I work with softball and have for about 9 years, and men's soccer most recently, along with some other sports over the course of my time at Michigan. So it's been a fun time, that's for sure.
That's fantastic, man. And so let's start first with I have two follow-up questions to that, but the first one being, so what is your day-to-day duties with the strength the now men's and women's or particularly women's, just so I kind of understand more.
Yeah, just women gymnastics. I spent a little bit of time with the men around the London Games, but over basically my entire duration at Michigan, it's been with almost exclusively the women's team.
Okay. So what are your kind of daily interactions with the women's gymnastics team? Is it more on the you're in the trenches with the actual, workouts and stuff? Are you going to the gym? Are you talking with the head coaches? You talking with medical? Kind of what's your role? Because I really want to paint the picture of how important it is to kind of have lanes and roles and interaction and communication.
Sure, yeah, and I actually love that lanes analogy. I talk a lot about it, and I'm
I
sure
stole it from you.
I'll definitely kind of cross that path, and I'll probably use my hands to talk a little bit in that process. But so as I kind of look at what my role is, I view it as an opportunity to address the physical development of our gymnasts, and that's over the course of the entire year. So obviously, the competitive season for us typically uh, starts in January and wraps up hopefully towards the end of April, uh, assuming that we make nationals, and that's the objective every year is to compete at NCAA championships and to strive for national championship, which we're working towards every day. But aside from that, my role over the course of the year, it varies based on the time of year we're in. So if you look at this time of year, kind of aside from the weird times we're in regarding COVID-19 and
Yeah.
the situation we find ourselves, typically this time of year is the time where I spend a lot of time with our gymnasts. And it's a voluntary capacity based on NCAA rules. But we've been fortunate over the last probably 8 or 9 years to have some really intrinsically motivated student athletes that have wanted to come back on campus, specifically for the second half of the summer, towards the end of May, beginning of June, and voluntarily train with me 3 to 4 times a week in the weight room in a more quote unquote traditional strength and conditioning setting. So in those sessions, anywhere from about an hour to an hour and a half, I'll work with the team to address basic strength development through full ranges of motion in a variety of different planes. I work to address good jumping and landing mechanics. I work to address anaerobic fitness development and overall mobility needs that will benefit them in the long run. So during this time, again, being voluntary, they do have access to the gym, but in a less structured capacity than they do during the academic year, really kind of beginning for us in September. So it's, to me, the time they see me the most frequently, and the most aggressive training they'll do with me happens during that June, July, August timeframe. As we move to September, my role transitions a little bit. They pick up their practice time. They go from basically entirely voluntary activities to up to 20 countable hours per week as per NCAA rules. Included in that time is time spent with me, but that means that they could go from as few as really just a couple hours a week in a more casual, laid back setting to up to 15, 16 hours a week with our coaches. And that jump and that spike in volume alone, just in pure time, is something that is always a conversation point for us. And by us, I mean specifically myself, Lisa Haas, our athletic trainer, that's been with Michigan Women's Gymnastics for a long time, long time, and is a tremendous resource for us at Michigan. And somebody that every year our head coach Bev Plotke says she wins the MVP. She's a great resource and somebody that I work really closely with, along with Bev, Scott, and Miley, and trying to create a plan that makes sense for us given the year and the time of year. So as we move into September, it's important that I understand what's going on in the practice setting, and it transitions to 2 to 3 times a week with me in the weight room, and a little bit more of that again traditional strength and conditioning setting, and 2 to 3 times a week in gym where I'm doing some pre-practice dynamic warm-up, plyo prep work, and addressing some of the preparatory activities to get them ready, especially on some of those hard tumbling days. Usually somewhere around Monday, Thursday, or Tuesday, Friday, depending on how that schedule kind of shakes out. And we'll see that schedule continue basically until December, where we really ramp up and gear up for competition beginning in January, at which point I'll see the team anywhere from 1 to 3 times a week based on the competition schedule, looking at what day of the week our meets are on. If we have a week where it's a 5-day turnaround, say a Sunday to a Friday meet, they may see me only once. Whereas vice versa, if it's a Friday, Sunday, and there's 9 days between, they may see me 2 or 3 times. So kind of taking each year kind of independent of each other to determine how often they'll see me and what I specifically do with them. But really that January to April time, my emphasis is not so much on enhancing development. It's maintaining the strength and overall fitness we've addressed over the course of the year prior to that, or the 6 or 7 months prior to that. And that year just kind of repeats itself over and over and over again. I keep getting older. They keep staying roughly the same age, which I'm trying to wrap my head around and be okay with. But they keep me young. They keep me on my toes.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a really good summary of kind of, how your role fits in for a performance lens. I think is what most people miss, is that everything we're talking about and why we want to have these conversations is because we all share the same goal, which you said is help the athletes perform at their best, move towards a common goal, which is your national championship for you guys, and keep them healthy in the process. And I really want to paint this picture for the background of why I wanted Lew on here, besides selfishly taking his knowledge, is I personally feel that we're at a major crossroads in gymnastics. And Lew and I had a really long discussion a couple weeks ago off kind of camera, but I think we're at a really good and also hard crossroads in gymnastics. Whereas for many years, it was only body weight, coaches drive the whole ship. There's no outside opinion. And we're seeing now, we're not going to go into it. We're seeing now there's been really negative consequences to what happens when we kind of take that lack of science approach, lack of interdisciplinary, and lack of multiple perspectives into the athlete's strength conditioning or just their wellness in general. So I feel like we're all trying to help people get to a healthier, longer career where the kids aren't so burnt out and aren't so having overuse injuries. And I really feel that we talked about this in terms of technical development with my buddy Nick Ruddick, who's a great coach, is that when people lack tools or information, or they lack seeing results, they often get frustrated, and they often take that frustration and it comes out negatively as more intensity or more load or more volume. And so for our context of this conversation, the athletes aren't fast enough. They don't see enough power. They don't see enough flexibility. They don't see enough cardiovascular anaerobic capacity for a 90-second floor routine to do really hard tumbling passes. And coaches get a little frustrated. And so they usually make up for these things with what they know and what they've been taught, which is not their fault, but is often not really in line with the scientific literature. Right. And so I'm curious to hear, how do we help educate people, or how do we get people to understand the benefits of, like you said, the non-gymnastic stuff? Like, it sounds like you have them for at least 2 to 3 months where you're able to do stuff, whether it's end of summer, start of fall, and they're spending, like you said, 3 to 4 days where they're not doing gymnastics. And for people on the gymnastics only side, that's like hypocrisy. Like, I can't believe you would take time away from training skills and give them general strength conditioning in a weight room. Like, that's dangerous. That's going to hurt them. And so I guess, can you paint the picture of the benefits of using, and what you've found has been helpful to help the athletes towards the end goal, versus what I think we're still kind of in, which is like the scared of the weight room, scared of the Lews of the world. We're scared of the strength coaches. You know what I mean? So I guess just share some thoughts there.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation. I think, and I'll kind of take a step back to my first few years at Michigan, and
Please.
the struggles that I had wrapping my head around the sport, the demands of the sport, the history of it to that point, and how we got to where we are, and where it was heading in that 2009, 10, 11 timeframe to where we are today, and how it's evolved slowly, but evolved in a positive sense.
Mm.
So I like to tell stories. I like to use actual experiences.
Hmm.
And just before this, I was out on a run thinking about this conversation, and it was a good time for me to reminisce a little bit on some of the people that were really impactful and created a lasting difference for my experience at Michigan with women's gymnastics, and the culture of the program related to strength and conditioning. And really, it's the class of 2014, which was a big class for us. And there's several kids that were influential in helping to kind of change the tide and the perception related to strength and conditioning and gymnastics. Rima Zachariah, Shelby Geis, Joanna Sampson. That class was awesome. And there's some others in there.
Hmm.
And being on the spot, I'm certainly going to miss them.
We'll look them up and put them in the show notes.
Yeah. But especially those three. Those three were kids that were talented and came in and made an impact as freshmen. As sophomores, we found our program struggling for the first time in a long time, and without a senior class that year, and with them as sophomores trying to lead the way but struggling due to some lack of motivation in the off season and just lack of general preparation. To their credit, they took ownership of that excuse me, that upcoming off season after the 2012 season, where we just didn't finish where we would expect to finish. We have high expectations. They saw the potential value that I could bring to the program in getting them back to where we expect to be year in and year out. And that class changed the tide. They stayed over the summer. They had a tremendous year in 13 as rising seniors in that off season of 13. That's kind of when the expectation became to train consistently and to take what I can offer in the strength and conditioning setting really serious. And by no means does that mean that anything we do is mandatory or required, especially during voluntary periods. But they truly bought into it, and it's just become what we do over the course of a competitive year. So it's a relationship building. It's being really simple and basic in my approach, and communicating what my objectives are, and being very specific. My objectives are not to increase muscle mass size, or to create any bulkiness, or to uh, uh, harm or damage any fast twitch muscle fibers, right? Hot button words and hot topic words that resonate really well with a lot of athletes and coaches, but certainly in gymnastics. And try to get out ahead of that before they saw that there might be some negatives related to it. I think people associate soreness from strength training with negative outcomes, and that's
Mm.
very short-sighted. It's a small snapshot. If you train consistently, that soreness dissipates. You start to become accustomed to the training stimulus over the course of time. And really, our approach is that recovery comes from a high level of preparation. And this is probably a different topic I'm sure we'll get into, but the high levels of physical preparation, strength development, anaerobic energy system development, that's what aids in recovery, not just foam rolling, not just massage, not just different modalities that make you feel good. It's really improving the overall durability and the general physical preparedness to handle high loads of training, and bounce back from that quickly and more effectively than somebody that's less generally physically prepared.
Mm.
So I think as I look back at my time, it's a matter of hearing what uh, some of uh, some of the student athletes' experiences have been, and try to be something different and to be someone different for them than maybe the negative vibe or negative impressions they've gotten previously from people in a role similar to mine, whether that was a sport coach serving as a strength conditioning coach, or a separate uh, coach or trainer or what have you. Try to be something different and be a resource and ally for them, and get them to want to come in and show up and train with purpose and intent, because they're, as you know, gymnasts are, they'll go to work. When they work, it's serious work. And I couldn't be any more appreciative and thankful for that class and all the classes since that bought into what I can offer. And it's a two-way street. I don't know everything. I don't know every answer. Neither does Lisa, neither does Bev, neither does anyone on our staff, and we don't pretend to. We understand that we can learn from them the same way they can learn from us. So that give and take really builds a nice dynamic, and I appreciate and value their input. I have for a long time, and I continue to as I tweak the program year after year.
Mm. Yeah, that's fantastic. And that you took a question kind of out of my mouth as I was wondering of someone who didn't come from the sport, how did you start to learn the sport, get your foot in the door? And obviously you're an extremely hardworking, curious person yourself. So I'm sure you were in the gym. I'm sure you were watching. I'm sure you were talking to the athletes. You were talking to Bev, to everybody else. And it's allowed you to come to a point where you're very knowledgeable about the sport and to do those things. And I think that's a very important takeaway for everybody here is I've seen so many really great strength coaches who were maybe intimidated and unwilling to extend the hand halfway. And I've also seen a lot of gymnastics coaches who had a little bit of an ego and were scared to maybe have someone expose their lack of knowledge in certain areas. And they took that as a defensive attack when it really was an offensive opportunity between the two of you. And so if you're listening, be the bigger person and reach out to gym coaches and be like, hey, can we have coffee? Can we sit down for lunch? I'd like to work with your team. And if you're a gymnastics coach and you're like, I'm definitely admitting that I need to do some more work in this department, or I need to figure out how to get more powerful, or have the kids be more anaerobically fit, or get through practices longer. Reach out to your local strength conditioning coaches and try to have that conversation, because the potential is phenomenal for you two to have a great working relationship.
Yeah, no question about that. And someone I didn't point out, not that I like name dropping, but I owe the success I've had in this profession to a lot of different people. And it's not just my mentors as strength and conditioning coaches. It's the people that have taught me a lot about the various sports that I work with. And one person I left out was Shannon Walker. Shannon was an assistant at Michigan when I first started in '09, and him and I worked really closely together for the 3 or so years that we overlapped prior to his time as the head coach now at Mizzou. And I learned a lot from him and spending time around him and picking his brain on gymnastics. And the first time I saw I saw him spot press handstands, I was like, I don't understand what's going on there. So it was eye opening to me. I've always, like I said, I've always been impressed with uh, the strength and the relative strength and flexibility of gymnasts, but to see it live and in action, especially in a training setting, and see how just challenging and demanding it was a really big eye opener for me. And it took time for me to wrap my head around the sport and how I can make an impact.
Mm.
Uh, and it still does. as the sport continues to evolve and student athletes come in from various backgrounds, whether they've taken the elite path and kind of transition off of the elite path, or they've actively pursued NCAA path more aggressively from a younger age. I understand that they're coming in with a lot of previous injuries and previous potentially negative connotations related to the service that I can provide. So I need to to be humble and to keep my ego in my back pocket and understand that I'm just part of the process. Nobody's going to come to Michigan. No women's Michigan women, excuse me, Michigan women's gymnasts will come to Michigan because of me and because of the fact that they get to spend time in the weight room. But when they come to Michigan, that's part of the deal. I'm part of that package. So I need to make sure that I do everything I can to ensure that they have the best experience possible, that they stay healthy, that they're physically prepared, and they put forth their best foot to go out and compete for championships and to, in most cases, leave the sport with a positive experience. Because we know that, at least as in the current state of gymnastics, at the end of the collegiate system, there is no professional realm, and the way that the international model is set up, we got some older folks in the sport. Whether that's right or wrong is probably a topic for a different day. But I think that's part of the paradigm that probably needs to shift and has started to, but is slow evolving.
Yeah, and I have a follow up from something you said before. But while we're on this topic, how do you do that? Because I mean, you're working with, like you said, some very high level 10 athletes who are pursuing a high Division I scholarship, or people who have trained elite and have lived in a system where, weights, barbells, kettlebells, squat racks are just, not only are they not helpful, they're the devil, right? They're going to make me Lew just spit as well.
Sorry. That's good. I gotta write that one down there. It's true. It's true though, right?
Yeah. And I think this is where I want to kind of dig into. There's 3 myths that I feel associated with why people aren't using weightlifting or external loading in gymnastics. One being flexibility, one being injury, and one being muscle bulk. And so we'll save those 3, but let's first talk about what's the conversation you're having with, maybe back in the day, the head coach or the assistant coaches, to be like, hey, I think we should add a little more weightlifting in the summer, or like more external loading in the summer. And then I'll give them back to you for more sports stuff. Or honestly, I'm thinking more the athletes. How do you wrap that around the athlete's head about, like, no, this is going to make you do a double layout better, or no, this is going to get you through a bar routine or a floor routine with your cardio?
Yeah. It's always an interesting conversation, and I'll tell you what, our coaches have done a really good job recruiting, or maybe it's just the nature of the sport. Again, my experience with gymnastics is kind of exclusive to Michigan, so I I can't tell you if it's a sport as a whole,
Sure.
but
It is.
yeah, which is
I can tell you.
which is certainly great, right? It's
Yeah.
you have people that want to be better, so it's a matter of recognizing it, right? So, like I said, you get out ahead of that, and I think you have the conversation with them that, especially if they're coming in with some sort of previous injury history, which we know that in NCAA gymnastics, it's literally the highest injury rates
Yeah.
for incoming student athletes. So, identifying what their previous injury history is and helping to reassure them that the services I'm going to provide are going to help to address what they probably needed to address for a long time, that they didn't, because of the lack of access to, or the hesitation to pursue that. So oftentimes I think you see that in sub NCAA gymnastics,
Mm.
they'll get back from an injury to the point where they're cleared. But what are they cleared for? They're cleared to get back and training in the gym on events, but are they really truly prepared to handle the stressors of all those hard landings and poundings day after day, week after week, month after month?
Yeah.
And oftentimes I think you see that that's not the case, and we've had several examples where they've come in. We've had student athletes that have come in unable to do a three pass floor routine. They'll come in, they'll train floor. They'll train with me. After a year or two, they can do a 2-pass and be creative with the coaches in terms of making sure they meet whatever requirements need to be met, which is certainly over my head. But by the time they're juniors or seniors, they can put together a legitimate competitive three pass floor routine, and that's rewarding to me. And it's a slow cooking process, and it's about understanding what they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with, giving them more of what they're comfortable with while sprinkling some things that they're unfamiliar with until they understand and start to feel better about the technique, the fact that they're not getting big and bulky, the fact that their flexibility is not impaired. If anything, it's probably improved as they develop strength or a fuller range of motion.
Hmm.
So I think that's certainly an area that's neglected in gymnastics and a lot of sports, but they start to see that and it starts to sell itself. So, like I said, with that class in 2014, in a lot of time, in a lot of ways, the upperclassmen sell the program to the underclassmen, uh,
Mm.
and they sell the fact that this is what we do and this is what makes me feel good. With that, in any sport, you get a group of student athletes, say a dozen student athletes, you might have four people that love what I offer. You might have four people that are somewhere in the middle. You might have four people that don't necessarily love it. I think if you can take advantage of the fact that those four kids love it and they can pull those middle four up,
Yep.
and that rear four that might not necessarily love it will do it, and they're compliant and start to swing towards the middle. I think you're in a really good position. So in a lot of ways, it's upperclassmen that continue to sell year after year as I make myself available and as I ask them questions. What have you done previously? What have you done in the gym that you really like, that you found beneficial, that I can learn from you, and what can I incorporate? And I
Mm.
think it's the truth, right? It's uh, as time goes on, I think you hear less and less new things per se, at least from my standpoint.
Yep.
So you hear some overlap in what they've done previously, but helping them to understand that the external loading, even though it might not necessarily be uh, a maximal external load in terms of we're not doing 1RM testing. We're not doing maximal or super maximal loading. We're loading oftentimes sub maximally, but externally loading more than they probably ever have before. So we might have somebody that is realistically capable of a back squat at 1.5 times body weight or more in some cases. I would guess uh, they probably won't touch more than maybe body weight for a few reps over the course of a specific training cycle, if they even get to that body weight.
Mhm.
But I'll take that 75% of body weight squat for multiple reps. Moved really well through a full range of motion with good positioning over what they would be doing previously, or which is nothing, right? No external
Yeah.
loading.
Yeah.
So I take what I can get and find some compromise as well. Uh, Gymnasts love circuits, and my opinion of circuits over the course of my career has changed dramatically.
Mhm.
I now love circuits because other people love circuits.
Yeah.
It's just that how I build out a circuit might look different than what they've done previously. So
Definitely.
it's still good hard work, and that might be where you get some ESD or energy system development, but it's not the entirety of what we do. It might be sprinkled in
Mm.
a few sessions or a few minutes within a given session, but aside from that, it's more traditional. Understanding that even the most bought in student athletes might have some hesitation on how much they should or could be loading
Mm.
externally.
Yeah. Super well said. And I definitely want to go back to what my original, piqued my interest was there's three myths that we have floating around that I think are really the big barriers here to a lot of people jumping on. And I want to start with the most obvious one that everyone's thinking about, which is not adding excessive, let's just call it non-lean body mass, right? Like bulk. They don't want to, and rightfully so, they don't want to throw off the balance of their skills or have a risk of something going weird because now they're a little bit, stronger than they thought in terms of this muscle development and stuff. And I think it's funny two ways. And this is actually happens with flexibility just the exact same way, and injuries. They're all paradoxes, right? One is being that with muscle bulk, people don't realize that thousands of reps of the same types of movements and body weight conditioning in gymnastics, which is like lots of squats, lots of leg lifts, lots of chin-ups, is going to cause hypertrophy. So they're giving prescriptions of high hypertrophy ranges with body weight only, but then getting upset that the athletes are doing it. I'm like, okay, well, who's writing the program here? So let's talk about one, maybe, let's just go on the positive side about like, how do you approach getting an adaptation that's helpful for explosive body power down the road or anaerobic capacity, right? But not having non-lean bodies add or having excessive bulkiness or things like that.
Yeah. I think that a big part of the equation that can't be neglected is the fact that hypertrophy is difficult without intentionally excess caloric intake. So
Sure.
this is the first time I'll use the lane analogy. I know you kind of alluded to it earlier, and we talked about it briefly, but I look at the service we provide at Michigan for our student athletes, specifically talking about the gymnasts right now. I have my lane, and I'm riding my lane, understanding the coaches have their lane. Lisa, our athletic trainer, has her lane. Our nutrition team, our dietitians have their lane. Our performance psychology, our athletic counseling team has their lane. So we're on this big 5 or 6 lane highway that we all are just kind of riding along. We need to be able to intersect our lanes, and this is probably one of the best examples of the intersection.
Mm.
So understanding that there's some sensitivity related to gymnasts and hypertrophy and getting big or bulky or whatever phrase you want to use. It's my time to take advantage of the fact that we have some really good professionals on the nutrition side, and work collaboratively with our registered dietitians to help not only track that information using BodPod and or DEXA over the course of their career, uh, but also the education side on the fact that it is impossible to literally gain significant muscle without a significant intentional change in dietary habits. And again, being sensitive and conscious around the fact that um, historically in gymnastics, there's some challenges related to disordered eating and eating disorders.
Mhm.
Uh, it's an area that I think is important for them to develop good habits, not only during the course of their 4 years with us, but for the remainder of their lives, and set them on a path of success
Well
for
said.
long-term health and well-being. So keeping that as part of the perspective, and getting them to understand that there is no good days or bad days, or cheat meals and good meals, or eating clean, or whatever the opposite of eating clean would be. I'm not really sure. Getting to understand that it's about balance, and it's about um, good good habits over the course of an extended period of time. And in the event that somebody is interested in intentionally adding some muscle mass, whether it's somebody coming off an injury that needs to get back to kind of a normal level of muscle mass on the affected limb or affected side, or it's somebody that just needs to address it for whatever the specific reason might be, then
Mhm.
we can work together to prescribe a training program that addresses a little bit more high volume and time under tension work,
Yep.
along with an intentional change in their dietary habits so that they see a slow and steady gain. That's not often the case in gymnastics. So in the event that somebody wants to maintain their body weight, I describe it like this, and there's a lot of misconceptions and negative. I don't
Connotation.
even say, yeah, yeah. Part of me want to say that, but it's really just it's misconception. So one of the questions I'll ask people, especially those that are a little bit more hesitant, is what weighs more, muscle or fat? Everyone hits me with, well, muscle weighs more than fat. And I'm like, this is a perfect opportunity for us to have the conversation that that's not a fully accurate statement. Especially if they're a kines major, or if they're interested in kines, it's a little bit easier conversation. But to say that muscle weighs more than fat is, it's just not, it's not correct in and of itself. So I get into the conversation about muscle being more dense than fat. So if you take a pound of muscle and a pound of fat, they both weigh a pound. They're both 16 ounces. One is more compact than the other, and we know that. But educating gymnasts on the fact that muscle is more dense, and conceptually you can carry more muscle and actually appear leaner but be heavier than somebody that carries more body fat. So one, eliminating the eye test. Two, falling back on the fact that uh, we have some really good measurements of body composition as a way to track consistently over the course of their career what some trends might be, and address any fluctuations positively or negatively, so that they remain at a more even keel energy level and level of lean body mass and body fat, to see sustained success over the course of time. So it's it's a I think a multidisciplinary approach, in the sense of I need to be able to step in and say, okay, I think now's a good time to work with our dietitian, Caroline or Tiffany or whoever it is. Over the course of the last 11 or 12 years, we have some different dietitians, and right now it's Kayla, who's actually a gymnast herself, so it's
Mm.
great. And
Sure.
so I'll pull in Kayla to the conversation, or suggest that they see Kayla, or have a conversation with Kayla. And it's not that, oh, you were I don't know, you got in trouble and you got scolded and I have to see the principal. It's Kayla's a great resource for us. She understands nutrition. She understands gymnastics, having been a gymnast herself as a young kid, and take advantage of the resource we have in terms of educating yourself and what we can offer. Same with Lisa. If I see somebody who might have some other concerns relating to ED or disordered eating, I might suggest that she work with Lisa or our athletic counseling team to address whatever's in the way for them to have a positive relationship with food as fuel and as energy.
Mhm.
So I see myself in a lot of ways as a connector with these other folks and other units that can really, again, provide the best experience for our student athletes. Um, so my answer to most questions, and we can talk for 10 hours about
Yeah.
this, I can probably start every answer to every question you have with it depends.
Mhm.
But it's true. Every situation is unique, and there's some overlap and similarities, but e- every individual will handle different conversations unique in themselves, and I think it's important to have those individual conversations and direct them to the people that will help them create the change that's most beneficial for them.
Mm.
So it's individual conversations. It's a human connection and interaction that goes a long way.
Yep.
Um, and I'd say it a lot, but it takes time. It takes time to develop that. And if we can get to them over the course of their 4 years, and you start to see the change in some people, especially those that might be towards that bottom four, that four that might uh, be a little bit more hesitant to take advantage of the services provided outside of the gym. If you can start to break down those barriers and demonstrate that you actually legitimately care about them,
Mm.
and it's great if they're good at gymnastics, but really you want them to just have a general positive experience, and I think you'd be surprised, and they find themselves surprised with how good they feel, uh, what their outlook and their perspective of being a gymnast is, especially if they had a negative experience leading up to their time here. And again, like I said, hopefully they leave here having a tremendous experience as they wrap up their gymnastics career.
Mm. Yeah, so well said. And I want to point out so many of the great things that you said there, right? Number one, you know your own lane. You're working with registered dietitians who are well educated, who get this stuff and are very sensitive and are aware of what's going on, but are not afraid to educate the athletes, right? Which is the second thing. It's all about an educational mindset. This is about fueling for performance and a common goal. And what are your hopes, your dreams, your visions? What do you want to get out of gymnastics? How can we help you get to those goals? It's never a conversation about what you look like or your weight on the scale or stuff. It's all about performance. It's about fuel for performance. And then even third, which was awesome, is that you were saying how much it's important to understand the individual nature of who you're talking to, right? Is this person coming from a situation where they've maybe had some issues in the past and you want to make sure you're respectful of those? Or obviously we're both men, right? So that's a very thing to think about is what is our relationship? Is this a female conversation that's more important? There's so many things that you said that resonate so well. And we just had a very popular episode with 4 registered dietitians and one friend, Josh, who's a sports chiropractor. And we just debunked a lot of these myths around these conversations. And I think it's just so important to realize that number one, back to our original question is your concern for excessive bulk very much is driven by some of these conversations happening with other professionals. So if you're not having these conversations and you're seeing things that are maybe concerning in terms of what your strength conditioning is doing, maybe your lack of knowledge or maybe your awareness of the situation needs to be addressed. And there's some opportunities here for you to learn more, for the athletes to learn more, and for everyone to be involved. But yeah, I just want to highlight so many of those great things you said, because I think that that's really the way to go about this in a professional way. And I also want to point out that in your circumstance, you're dealing with, 18 to 21, 22-year-old, fully mature female athletes who are very cognizant of their own performance and their well-being. We're not talking to 12, 13-year-old athletes that are pre-puberty and going through it. So like the conversation that you're able to have around DEXA scans, around those kind of things, body fat, body weight, is very different than what somebody might have with someone who's very young. And if you missed that episode about how to address that, please go back and do it. But yeah, tons of great stuff. So I guess putting into perspective how important recovery, nutrition stuff is. Now, I guess on the tactical side of strength conditioning, are you programming differently? Are you thinking about different exercises? Are you using different variables? You mentioned like the body weight, squatting, and percentage, right? But are there things that you're doing on a strength conditioning side to really drive the adaptations towards non-bulked and more explosive body weight power?
Sure. Yeah, and I think you bring up some really good points there. So, um, you know, I've like I said earlier, my appreciation for gymnastics and gymnast level of relative strength is it's always been high, and working with gymnasts, it remains high. Um, with that said, I think it's the external loading through full ranges of motion and a variety of different planes that goes a long way. So we will do some traditional strength movements. So I look at kind of 5 buckets of movement categories that I address pretty consistently over the course of the entire year. How aggressively I load them will depend on where we are within the year and who the individual is. But those buckets being the ability to squat, the ability to hinge at the hips, the ability to uh, brace through the midsection and actually create some rigidity through the torso. I'm not a huge fan of the phrase core,
Yeah.
but we can talk about the core. It's upper body pulling and upper body pushing or pressing. So I think the ability to address kind of all 5 of those buckets with a variety of different exercises is really important, and they provide similar stimuli, but are movements that, especially the first 3 I mentioned, squatting, hip hinging, and bracing, aren't necessarily movements that are are developed uh, robustly over the course of a young gymnast career. I think the upper body pressing and pulling probably a little bit more with pull-up variations and push-up variations, although I think we could still improve those and the positioning of some of those. Those first 3 buckets are areas that I try to provide stimulus in those categories, um, really on a kind of multiple time a week basis. So squatting for me isn't just double leg bilateral back squatting. It's back squatting. It's front squatting. It's safety bar squatting if somebody's coming off an Achilles injury or a lower body injury that's a significant time loss injury, where we want to uh, limit the stress on the lower leg or at the knee, and that's a topic we can also discuss. It might be single leg squatting, it might be lunging or split squatting or lateral lunging, Bulgarians. I think squatting is squatting. It's just a matter of
Mm.
is it single leg, is it double leg, and addressing some of the key points to that strength through a full range of motion to help protect the knee, especially if somebody has a history of knee injury. Develop that strength through a full range of motion. Uh, Hip hinging, man, I think being able to understand how to hinge at the hips and to load posteriorly is really, really important in gymnastics. Again, looking at uh, a means of limiting the severity of injury and mitigating injury risk, right? There's a lot of different phrases you can use that again, talking about the core earlier, not my favorite phrase. Injury prevention, not my favorite phrase, but I think reducing the likelihood of catastrophic or significant time loss injury is really important. I think squatting through full range of motion and developing posterior chain strength, specifically lower body posterior chain strength, goes a long way. And hip hinging is a huge piece of that puzzle. And the bracing piece, right? We know this. Gymnasts can sit down and they can do core work or ab work or whatever you want to call it all day long. They can sit there. They can do a ton of trunk flexion work, just trunk flexion, trunk flexion, trunk flexion. It's hanging. It's on the ground. They eat it up, and I think gymnastics coaches eat it up, and it's part of the sport. And I get that, and I think it's certainly not an area that we don't address in any way, shape, or form. But I know they get so much of that, and they're going to do a lot of that on their own if they don't get it from me. And if they do get it from me, they'll probably still do a lot of it on their own. So what can I provide to them from a bracing standpoint, from a midsection development or torso development standpoint that will set them up for success and is different than what they might be accustomed to. So I've talked a lot about positioning and being able to brace through the midsection over the course of my career, and specifically the last probably 3 or 4 years, I've started to look at it a little bit differently. So looking at anti-extension, anti-rotation, and understanding the position of the diaphragm relative to the pelvis and being able to brace under load. And I say that's very specifically, I brace under load because as we do load with any sort of external stimulus, I want them to be set up in a position where the spine remains in a relatively neutral and more or less fixed position,
Mm.
where there's not an excessive lordotic arch or a ton of thoracic flexion, which I think are common things that you'll see in gymnasts. So getting them to understand how to brace and to brace under load carries over into my squat variations, into my hip hinge variations, and any other anti-extension or anti-rotation work that we might do. So I get creative with that. Dead bug variations, different plank variations. I've started to do a lot of bear position work, started to pay attention to breathing and understanding diaphragmatic breathing in terms of helping to break the extension, compression, stabilization strategy that I think a lot of athletes, specifically gymnasts, find themselves in.
Mm-hmm.
You can, if I talk about somebody being in kind of an extended position where it looks like their pelvis is tilted and they can't break that, we all picture someone in our heads. Oftentimes it's a gymnast that looks like they're stuck in that position. So can I help them get out of that position and alleviate some of the discomfort that they're likely experiencing in their lower back through a variety of different exercises to not only improve core strength or strength of the torso, but also to alleviate that pain and be something that we can address consistently over the course of multiple exercises within a given day, week, month, and so on over the course of their career. So it's a kind of multi-faceted or multi-layered approach that I take. Uh, all I talk about this and I think about it in some complex ways, but I try to simplify it as much as I can when I present that to our student athletes.
Mm.
And same way when I talk to a sport coach or somebody that might be relative novice as it relates to strength and conditioning, stick to the basics: squat, hip hinge, brace, upper body push, and pull with good positioning and good brace positioning in a lot of ways will go a long way for you. As you get more and more comfortable, add some variation to that, but focus on good positioning in those 5 buckets of categories, and that'll take you a long, long way.
Mm.
Um, we can get into some of the external loading and
Yeah.
what the volume and sets and reps look like if you're
Yeah.
interested. Yeah,
Yeah. We'll follow up on that. And I kind of want to, I mean, I'm fortunate to have it be a strength conditioning coach. So I love this language with you, but like just for the listeners, I want to paint a picture of why this is so important, right? So I'm going to go through the gymnastics transition, right? Squatting, jumping and landing, right? Hinging, every single takeoff of a vault or a floor tumbling pass, right? Every single end of range hip extension that you're snapping, right? Bracing, everything in gymnastics. Upper extremity pushing, every Yurchenko you've ever done in your life. Upper extremity pulling, every time you've tapped on a high bar, right? And then bracing under load, every dismount at the end of a pass or the end of a routine when you're dying, right? Or landing your last pass after you just flooded your body with anaerobic hydrogen ions, right? And learning how to breathe and feel like you're going to die. But again, diaphragm has a dual role as a postural muscle, but also as keeping you alive, right? And so under the gun, is your brain going to choose keep my optimal pelvis position, or is it going to choose live? It's probably going to choose live. So it's going to
sure.
compromise pelvis position for that. So these things that you're talking about that are so important in terms of like, yeah, let's front squat, let's hip lift, let's farmer carry, let's, do whatever. Like they have a direct performance boost available in gymnastics if you're open to using them correctly. Right. And I think that's so important for people to understand is like, I think people really struggle sometimes to look at like squatting makes sense because of jumping and landing, but they struggle to look at a trap bar deadlift or a hip lift variation. And they can't really conceptualize where that goes in gymnastics. So like, you could probably make a copy paste of every single movement he's talking about, which are just how all athletes move, right? Gymnasts are unique, but not different.
Sure. Yeah, I love that. I'm gonna borrow that.
Yeah, I
They're unique but not different.
still have
Yeah, that's great.
yeah, let's dig in one more layer to this because I think people are like, okay, I get it. I understand what you're saying. So now let's kind of dig into maybe the geekier stuff too, and don't be afraid to be technical or more on the science side because yeah, let's talk about either, rep and set ranges or what you're doing with more like ballistic, like rate of force development stuff, or is it med ball work? Is it a trap bar deadlift? Like what kind of stuff are you using on the tactical exercise selection or prescription that's maybe again biasing, not getting bulky and explosive power?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question, and I think um, I'll start with it depends. It depends on the time of year, but I
Sure.
think there's always room to address that. I think in season probably addressing it a little bit less again from that maintenance side, but I think in the early off season reinforcing some good positioning and working on some depth drops and landings in a more controlled setting than they might get in the gym.
Yep.
Understanding they're coming off a long year and they're probably a little beat up even though they've had some time off. So I think addressing that, I think jump variations, both single and double leg jump variations, single leg and double leg jump landings,
Mhm.
um, both horizontal and vertical, linear and lateral, right? So incorporating a variety of jumps with different focus is focus eye
Focus on.
yeah, with different intents, right?
Yeah.
And providing a varied stimulus over the course of a training cycle. So I'd say each day probably for me includes some sort of explosive component. Sometimes it's more body weight focus and emphasis. There's some days where it's more significant loaded emphasis. It might be some trap bar jumps or some clean pulls with the barbell,
Yep.
where again it's loaded, approaching towards body weight in some cases, which there's nothing wrong with doing that consistently, but not as the sole exclusive means of developing power. And then there's some days that are lighter, like med ball work or some kettlebell work,
Mm-hmm.
or some resisted jumping, whether it's using some bands for jumps, whether it's using dumbbells. So I look at power as force times velocity, right? So I think addressing both the force and the velocity component, kind of getting back to trap bar jumps and clean pulls and some heavier loaded movements, but at a high speed. So high force, high velocity movements, or to me, result in the highest power outputs. Understanding that they need to address that force velocity curve on kind of every end of the spectrum. So there's some days that are lower force, right, just body weight, but higher velocity. Is meant to be quicker. It's meant to be more reactive. So maybe it's some repetitive jumps, whether they be single leg jumps or double leg jumps or what have you. And there's some days that are somewhere in the middle where it's resisted, so it might not be as high velocity, and it's certainly not as high force, but the resulting power output is beneficial for their overall explosiveness and preparation. So I think having some components of each of those kind of, I'll call them groupings of power based exercises is important, especially in the off season as we get closer and closer to the year. That's the high force component. So those clean pulls might lighten up, or we might pull them out entirely, but we'll still have body weight and some lighter resisted plyometric based exercises. Um, I think the other side to something I started doing a few years ago, and it's funny, I call them astronaut jumps,
Mm-hmm.
because this goes back to having input from the student athletes. We started doing some assisted jumping with bands in the weight room attached to a pull-up bar, or we'll do it in the gym at a high bar. The whole concept being, if the band's pulling you up, it's as if you're leaving the ground at, say, 80% of body weight. Similarly, you're landing at a reduced load.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more repetitive. You get a little bit more reactiveness out of that. And rather than calling them band assisted jumps, somebody probably about 5 or 6 years ago said they feel like an astronaut. And I'm like, okay,
I
we're going to
like it.
call these astronaut jumps. And that's just how it's going to be. So you have a little bit of fun with it. But that's also something I'll use with uh, individuals coming off of lower body injury, starting to work back into some jumping and landing mechanics, again at a reduced load. That's an easy way to do it. We can do that in the Alter G as well, but obviously the Alter G is meant primarily for running, although you can
Handstand
take
walk.
advantage. Yeah, yeah. You can take advantage of the fact that it is a reduced load, so you can do some low level plyometrics in the Alter G. But I find astronaut jumps are a nice way to bridge that gap as they return to activity and ultimately back into the gym. So for me, it it my power development exercises are based around the time of year we're in and how often I'll see them. Uh, Typically incorporating some type of power development in probably a majority of my sessions, even if it's in small doses. Some people, I think that the popular phrase in our profession is over the last year or two has become microdosing. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's just low levels of total volume, but never totally neglecting the ability to address um, uh, power output and high velocity movements. So I think that's important um, to developing fast twitch muscle fiber. And I hesitate to use that phrase, but again, I think it's a common phrase that's easily understood. You're just improving overall motor unit recruitment and firing patterns, right? It goes a long way um, over the course of a student athlete's career.
Yeah, super well said. Lots of great stuff there. And I really want to highlight something that you mentioned kind of in the force times velocity, because another take home point that I think from a performance side, I think we're leaving a lot on the table because we're not understanding the science here behind it, right? So, and we've discussed this before, but like we kind of have two different ways to maximize the force times velocity equation, right? We have the more of the neurological side, and we have more of the biological, or so neuroplastic or bioplastic changes, right? And I think on the gymnastics side, we really maximize the neurological bucket, right? Where we're teaching kids how to be really stiff, right? When they do some of their plyos and stuff like that. We're teaching kids how to create high levels of tension with whole body squeezing. And what's that doing is that's synchronizing available motor units, right? That's allowing you to access what you have better and maybe squeeze the juice out of the orange so much that you're really, really not leaking too much energy. But also, like on the velocity side, that's where technique comes in, right? Having better technique helps to maximize stiffness and reduce energy. You learn how to tune the equipment, you tune the floor, you tune the rails, you can put your hands in a better position to have more potential energy, right? All these things. But like on the other side of the equation, like there's so much potential we're losing because we're not entertaining some of these bioplastic changes that come from external loading, which is well documented, which is recruiting larger muscle units to access for big power outputs, right? Or like disinhibition, for example, of like using external load of progressive overload helps to unlock more motor units because your body's like, oh man, I'm having a tough time getting this load up. I need to do this. Or you get some fatigue involved and you fatigue out some earlier motor units you're used to using in your last 7, 8, 9, 10 reps of those end range cycles you get. But also, I think what's really important and a potential that a lot of people could like really have a light bulb moment is like the ability to express maximal impulse and power in a safe setting is a huge opportunity for gymnasts, right? Because we all know being able to go full bore on a full in or a double layout is hard because you're nervous about the potential injury, right? But there's really not a lot of risk if you're doing it well with like an explosive med ball throw or an explosive trap bar deadlift or like some sort of sled pushing that's really aggressive with high impulse, right? Like, and I think that's a huge opportunity that we're leaving potential on the table because if you can safely put somebody, and well, maybe we'll touch on this with energy systems too, but like you can like try to throw this thing as hard as you possibly can, like break the ball in half. You're going to get way more out of that versus like do this tumbling pass as hard as you possibly can. Don't hold back at all. Like there's what has the more risk, you know what I mean? One clearly has more risk with the actual skill. So I think that's where people could get more buy-in maybe with people around them or their athletes about like how much power they could unlock.
Sure. Yeah, and I think you bring up some really good points there. It's more or less the setting that I work with the team in is a fairly controlled setting.
Mm,
Accidents can always happen, but certainly it's more controlled than you would experience in the gym. It's just a fact of the matter. There's I think a greater potential to develop some of the traits and characteristics that carry over well to gymnastics in our setting and give them confidence. So one of the other tactics or modalities, I guess is probably a good word, that I'll use is post-activation potentiation. So that's
mm,
again another way to address some strength development, a little bit higher intensity, but pretty low volume. So it's not a ton of fatigue accumulation from that heavier loaded movement, say a back squat or a trap bar deadlift or what have you, followed by something a reduced load but higher velocity. So you're working on both sides of the spectrum: high force, lower velocity, higher velocity, lower force, or even kind of getting into some kind of French contrast training, which I've borrowed a bit from Cal Dietz.
yep.
Um,
Shout out
it,
Minnesota.
yeah, Big Ten partner there. Uh, and so taking advantage of the fact that we can do a heavy movement, a body weight movement, and an assisted movement, let's say,
Mm,
and looking at getting them to tap in and improve the motor pattern or the motor unit recruitment and the patterning of a similar movement without accumulating excess fatigue goes a long way.
yep.
Not everything, and this is slightly off tangent, but it relates to I think this bigger conversation. Not everything you have to do in terms of conditioning or strength development has to be incredibly fatiguing. It's you don't have to leave feeling like you're on the verge of losing your lunch, and that's something that also I think is difficult for a lot of people to wrap their head around,
Uh-huh.
and that's in gymnastics or in athletics in general, and really probably even in the non-athletic population or the general population, if you will. You don't have to leave feeling exhausted and like you couldn't possibly do one more rep of any exercise
Mhm.
without feeling like you're going to collapse. It's not about that. Now, there's sessions that are harder than others and more challenging than others for a variety of reasons. Hopefully, intentionally by a strength coach that knows what they're doing.
Mm,
But it should never be about running someone into the ground to make them feel like they got a good workout. Huge, just a generally speaking, a huge pet peeve. Not that I meant to get on my soapbox there, but there's some sessions that my intent is to get them feeling pretty darn good and I'll use some words like snappy or quick or reactive when they leave the session with me, especially in October, November, December as the training volume picks up. That's where you see some of that microdosing, and it's about good quality over quantity. Whereas in the summertime, it's a little bit more quantity to develop that general physical preparation. And that's where periodization as a whole comes in, right? This is what the entire conversation is based around is periodization. There's times for me in my role to really be expanded, and I take a more heavy duty or involved role. There's times where my role backs off. It might be less time with me. It might be the same amount of time, but different focus. And as we get more and more into the competitive season, my role has to drop off in terms of the intensity, to some extent the intensity, but in larger extent the total volume that I'm with the team and providing to them, to ensure that they're at their peak, at their best when it's most important for them to be at their best in April.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the example you gave around like not always feeling like you're buried by your workouts, the best example that I have that I've had to have the biggest facepalm moments with myself is the concept of developing, whether they call it alactic repeat sprintability in a whole body form or just anaerobic capacity, right? Like when you look at that energy system, and I'm super lucky that Power Monkey Camp, I met Chris Hinshaw, who is one of the best energy system coaches, around in terms of like he coaches Matt Frazier and like all these like studs in like the CrossFit world, right? So he was a competitive triathlon runner at the highest level and marathon runner. And so like when he was talking about developing sprint potential, he's like, yeah, we're looking at a 1 to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 work to rest ratio with maximal efforts. And I was like, wait a minute. Wait a minute.
Let me do some math here.
I got 30 minutes in a cardio session. That means I'm going to be working for 6 minutes out of all of my like stuff. And so I started programming workouts that he was teaching me where we would do like a 2 to 3 minute, feel like your brain's going to fall out because you're going so hard on sled pushes or whatever you're doing. And then you would do some very active, low type 1 lunges or presses with very slow movements to clear some of that fatigue from the type 2 fibers. But like, I was like, the kids are just standing around forever. It's like, it was so hard to have the inner itch of me of like my old school coaching day, which is like circuits and everyone has to be sweaty and huffing and puffing. And I realized, I look back, I'm like, I was just creating long, awful aerobic circuits and nobody was getting better at their 3-floor, tumbling routine because I wasn't training the right adaptations of 2 to 3 minutes of hard work or like upper body bike sprints and then some sort of clearance with what would represent dance or leaps or jumps and then another go get them movement. And like, oh yeah, the reason they were falling on their last pass all the time is because of me, because I wasn't programming correctly and I didn't understand anaerobic windows and stuff like that. So that's one of the best examples that I've had problems with, but I still see all the time in gymnastics that I wish people would just get a little educated on, because like you could use 30 minutes and get a super specific anaerobic lower body adaptation. And maybe it doesn't look that hard, quote unquote, but I'm telling you, man, strap up and do one of those workouts and then let me know how you feel after a couple of salt bike sprints. It's hard and it looks different, but the adaptation is there.
Yeah, no question. I think it does. It looks different. And I think people inherently, we're afraid of change, and we're afraid of doing things differently than we've done them previously.
Mm-hmm.
There's fear in the unknown, and that was a big kind of hurdle for me to clear and to wrap my head around when I first started with the sport, and it continues to be in some ways, but less and less as time goes on. It's hard to say, okay, we're gonna do hard 10-yard sprints. A 10-yard sprint, realistically, 3 seconds really from the second they start to actually decelerating. So if I'm taking a 1 to 10 work to rest ratio, I'm looking at a 30-second rest. How do you get a group of gymnasts that want to get after and are used to the go 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 go? How do you get them to rest for 30 seconds after they work for 3 seconds, right? And that's where some creativity comes in. It's setting up a session so that there's a certain number of lanes and a certain number of people are going at a time to build in some rest to that, or maybe it's incorporating some mobility, being a little bit different than flexibility, but incorporating some mobility drills that are beneficial, that aren't super taxing, that serve as a kind of a buffer time between reps of a really high intensity exercise that demands a high extended rest period relative to the amount of work. So it's being creative with that. Sometimes there's some benefit to having less equipment. So you use aerosol as an example.
Satan's
Yeah, sure. I love it. So we have last few summers, we just added a few this past year prior to closing down. But the last few summers, we had uh, for the Stairmaster versions of the air bike and the fan bike. So with a group of 12, you can't you have to build in rest. So inherently, having less equipment in that sense, it builds it out for you. So we can do some hard 10 or 15-second goes with extended rest between, because you have to let everyone get on the bike and work through that. There's some transition time, which I don't get frustrated by that. Oh, somebody had a hard time strapping their foot in the pedal. No big deal. That gives us a little bit more time to rest that I wanted anyway. Sorry that you're struggling and that we're kind of cracking jokes that you can't get your foot in the pedal, but even if your foot was in the pedal, we're still going to wait. So now it's just a chance for us to have a kind of lighthearted moment.
Mm.
And in some ways, that builds some rapport and just general good camaraderie. It shows that I have a personality, and it shows me that they do as well, right?
Uh-huh.
Which is a
Yeah.
whole nother topic.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, we're gonna be here for 5 hours. This is great, right? I love how we kind of tapped into that energy system kind of thing. But let's switch gears and talk about the next big myth, which everybody has, which is, if I lift weights, I'm gonna become the thing, and I'm not gonna be able to touch my toes, and I'm gonna be like the most, tightest athlete ever of all time. And I'll just share some of the research about behind this, and then I definitely want to hear your opinion on, how you're either educating the athletes or what you've seen kind of anecdotally with people who are maybe about that. But I mean, if you look at the literature on how to gain flexibility, I think it's a pretty good summary now of that. Foam rolling, stretching, consistent stretching is not changing the muscle length itself, right? And you could argue with rat studies or a rabbit that they tack up against a holder for 60 days, right? Different situation. But in us normal humans, we're just desensitizing what are called nociceptors, which are probably just the things that sense your stretch at entering and go, ooh, back off a little bit, right? So consistent stretching every day and doing all that kind of stuff, some blood flow, some maybe hydration of the muscle, some heart rate, stuff like that. And then consistent stretching, what gymnastics usually does is desensitizing a lot of the muscle, right? What actually causes or what causes elongation of the muscle, or called sarcomere where you truly get some structural changes in the muscle length, or you actually get collagen adaptations, has to be some sort of load, right? And the eccentrics world of literature has shown this with barbell RDLs or with other things that are more higher time under tension or whatever. That is what seems to be expressing more collagen or causing more of an elongated muscle. And we do not need to go into this, but you get a signal through the muscle mechanically, right? Mechanotransduction, and that causes genetic changes, expression of epigenetic markers that then say, hey, more collagen, add some more muscles. This is intense, whatever it is. So that's the two buckets, right? So what gymnastics is doing is not really causing true structural muscle length. We're probably getting capsular laxity. But then at the same time, when we talk about weightlifting or whatever we're doing, not only are you not going to have a long-term change in your stiffness, right? If you're doing your soft tissue care, if you're actually you respect your DOMs 2 to 3 days in advance, like we're negating the acute soreness, but like the research is actually supportive of eccentric loading to help increase long-term flexibility. And so I think this is one of the craziest examples of a myth or a paradox that exists. Is not only is it not bad for you, it's actually good for you. And we've seen some significant changes in the college athletes. We have a lot of college athletes that come from all their division schools and come to us for the summer training, or like junior national team people who are with us. And like, they're like, I can't believe my flexibility is sticking around. Not only do I feel not stiff right after my first day of being sore, I actually feel looser. My shoulders feel more mobile because I'm doing eccentric pull-up lowers, or I'm doing some sort of Kaiser row, or I'm doing our favorite personally is some sort of bilateral extended split squat rear foot, because both can extend into a deep split pattern, which is a split for gymnastics switch leaps. They're like, wow, I feel my hips are super loose after I do a good warm up and a good soft tissue care and a good, extended eccentric load. And like, that's a perfect example of like, not 5x5 max load split squats, but 5-second tempo pause split squats with lighter weight under more time under tension can significantly increase your flexibility, like notably. So that's my soapbox. But what are your thoughts on any of that, or also what you're doing to try to sell that to some of your athletes?
Sure. Yeah. I don't talk. The last I can recall talking about sarcomere certainly was not in the weight room. It's
Exactly
been some time. So you hit me with that. I'm like, whoa, okay, here we go. I'm ready. So I think as you look at strength development and the potential to impact flexibility either positively or negatively, I think it's important to look at it in a chronic sense, right? So you talked acutely. DOMS, short-term adaptation, and that's something I talk about with freshmen especially. And I remind the upperclassmen as they're getting back in the off season, or if there's an extended time off for whatever reason, is that remember that's short-lived, and that's not an indication that of performance and a negative to it. Well, let's continue to work through that, and I think oftentimes they're surprised at how good they feel with some DOMS when DOMS is present. How good they feel as they go through a training session, subsequent training sessions. So if the first day back is a Monday, Tuesday they feel like they got kind of run over by a bus, even if it's a pretty conservative session. They come in for Wednesday for an additional session. It might be even worse. We go through a good dynamic warm up. We do some good quality strength training exercises that are again similar and address those buckets I talked about earlier. And they'll leave the session feeling surprisingly good. And oftentimes they'll say, I feel way better than I did when I walked in. Why is that? And let's talk about that. What's going on there? What happened to you? And without getting too into the science, one, because in all honesty, getting super deep as I think you just did, it's a little outside of my realm, and certainly it's outside of the realm of a lot of our student athletes. And that's not to downplay their intelligence.
Yeah.
It's just that oftentimes they don't get that or not super interested in that. And I certainly wouldn't present that in a way that's clear and concise at a really high level.
Yeah.
So, and that's no one's fault, right? It's just the state of it's a fact of the matter. So as far as why, we talk about it. Well, you increase blood flow to the areas that we've addressed, right? Lower body soreness or DOMS in the lower body. Your groin's tight, your hamstrings are tight, your quads are tight, your hip flexors are tight from a variety of exercises you did on Monday. Well, we address that. We increase blood flow to the area. We went through full ranges of motion that maybe you've neglected since that training session. You're starting to develop strength through those ranges because you maintain control throughout the duration. And over the course of time, if you can maintain that, assuming that you stay healthy and maintain and address and really push end ranges without losing positions, I think that's where you help to maintain, if not improve, flexibility. Whereas strength training through partial ranges of motion, although there's some benefit to that at different times of the year and for certain individuals, I think that's where you'll see some limitations and some potentially lack of flexibility or decreases in flexibility and potential bulkiness. There's never any right or wrong exclusively, but I think too much of one, too much of especially the limited range of motion strength training is a potential negative impact, or has a potential negative impact on flexibility. And understanding that, it's important that we address that appropriate technique and educate them on the importance of performing movements through as full a range of motion as they're physically capable.
Yep.
If they're not, identifying what their potential limitation is and addressing that. So if somebody's lower leg mobility or ankle mobility is god awful, well, let's address that. What can we do to improve ankle mobility? And until it's at a point where I feel really comfortable about their technique, what modifications can we make in terms of putting them in weightlifting shoes or elevating their heels with a wedge, setting up a safety squat bar so they can counterbalance and keep from that anterior translation of the knee? What can we do as an adjustment or modification? Hopefully, ideally, in kind of a short term until we address the area that's the limiting factor, knowing that it might take time and we just might not have the time to fully to get it to a point where it's fully acceptable. So we might need to continue making modifications over the course of that training period for whatever the reason is. So to me, it's a matter of finding ways to find fuller ranges of motion through those movements we talked about earlier. And that's where being creative and having some adaptability and flexibility goes a long way. If somebody's dealing with a shoulder issue, if I can change their hand position on a push-up or a dumbbell bench press, to have them go through a more full range of motion with more comfort or less discomfort, I think that goes a long way in helping keep them healthy in that sense.
Yeah, no, I love what you said there, especially with like the end range kind of discussion, which is we see this a lot in the clinic and other sports as well. But like there's a very big difference between dynamically swinging to an end range unprotected under, that's what a leg kick is, right? An aggressive leg kick. And we're not going to go into it, but this is where ankle weights become myth and not really an appropriate thing that we're doing in gymnastics. But there's a very big difference between just swinging your leg to end range as hard as you can and possibly risking some overload of the hip or the shoulder versus developing through slow, repetitive building protected end ranges, which is an extended split squat range of motion where you feel comfortable there, right? Or in the gymnastics world, you would use like sliders and split slide outs, right? That's a very famous one there. But there's a very big difference there between eccentric and pausing or using the end ranges in a safe way and getting those to stick, quote unquote, because you're loading them and you're, you make the argument of whether you're actually increasing enough joint mobility between the adaptations or your brain is just feeling safer at end range, whatever it should be. But so many injuries happen when ballistic high force is placed on end ranges of motion repetitively, baseball throwing, gymnastics, right? All these kind of movements that are very extreme physiologically. That's where we get into a lot of hot water. So that's where the role of strength conditioning is to help protect that a little bit. And I love that you said that.
Yeah, I I think over the course of my career, I've started to borrow concepts from different avenues, and whether that's personally going through some more formalized education or informally tapping into colleagues and coworkers that might have more expertise in a specific area, podcast, webinars, articles, whatever I can read. So two examples of that. One is DNS, or dynamic neuromuscular stabilization, is something I've spent some time um,
It's probably one drop world.
yeah, yeah. So for me, it's educating myself in that, and I think that's where I've gained a better understanding of positioning, diaphragmatic breathing, the position of the pelvis relative to the torso, and being able to flex and extend the spine segmentally. And I think there's some overlap with some different concepts, right? You talk about PRI a little bit, you talk about FRC, and I think FRC, both PRI and FRC, are areas that
Yep.
have some exposure to, but no formalized training. Not that I'm a DNS expert, but I've gone through some coursework.
Yep.
So a little bit more expert on the scale of expertness than I am with FRC and PRI, but taking concepts from those other areas as well and tapping into the people that are more well versed in those specific areas. And FRC is one for me that, as I look to continue kind of filling my toolbox, I need to get a better understanding of the concepts they use for developing strength through end ranges of motion,
Yep.
and uh, through a variety of different really drills or exercises or movements. So it's something that I don't know. I don't have every answer in the book, but I know that there's something to FRC the same way I think there's something to DNS and PRI and this alphabet soup that exists somewhere that I don't even know what it is yet, right?
Yeah, I took FRC in 2013 with Andrea when he was here in Connecticut at Ren Phones, actually, which is pretty popular up here in the world. By like that's like we have like Boyle, Cressy, Ren Phone, us at Mike Ronald and stuff like that. So I took it and it was great, and I love the concepts there. And I think it's one of those things where when you look at the traditional gymnastics methods, we've been diving in a little bit, but they do a great job of painting some of the tissue pathology or the tissue histology studies behind it. And I think it goes in, and this is a perfect lead to my next question about like there's a role for some of these active, they call it active flexibility in gymnastics. FRC, has their terminology, whatever you would call it. But there's really a role to play here in the strength conditioning realm, helping to do soft tissue care and do more active mobility that maybe in a general sense versus it's so sport specific in the gymnastics setting. And I think this is like a really important concept that completely changed my medical career and my strength conditioning career with my boss, Mike Ronald, who works with so many baseball players. Is there's kind of a U curve here of how sport specific your movement patterns are and how much variability you have here, right? You can be certainly not gymnastics enough where you don't have a good technical basis, you don't have the shaping, you're not doing enough of the proficiency of the mastering of the basics. But in my world, what I see, especially on the medical side in terms of mobility losses, you can be too gymnastics specific. Right? And we see this in the baseball world is we've known and we've shown this through studies that if you throw a bullpen and you throw hard and you lose overhead elevation, you might also lose some of your layback and you're at more risk of an elbow injury, but also your performance is going to drop down because you can't hit your velo. And we've seen this in Olympic lifters, and we've also seen this in so many gymnasts because we're fortunate to see across the whole year how people change on movement screens and stuff. And we've seen that if you swing a lot of bars, if you're a bar specialist, you lose overhead mobility, you may start to become too gymnastic specific and you start to maybe tweak your back because now you're tapping from you're hinging from your back instead of using your lats. Vice versa, gymnasts squeeze their legs together and point their toes and squeeze their quads for a living every day. So if you get too gymnastic specific, of your quad, your adductors, and your calves being stiff, you're going to lose your opposite pattern, which is a squat, which is your legs apart, hinging, right, and squatting with ankle dorsiflexion. So we've definitely seen getting too far gone on one side. And on the medical side, we're doing a lot of maintenance care on trying to prevent some of those things. I want you to be you, is what Mike tells me, right? Like, I don't want you to be more than you or less than you. When you pick up a baseball, when you walk out to do bars, I want you to be the best version of you, which is how your movement screen is normal. And that's where strength conditioning comes in, right? Like, I'm curious to ask if in your warm-ups, are you addressing some of those mobility soft tissue things? Or like you said, with your anaerobic systems work and your energy systems, is that a place where you kind of put in some active mobility? Or is it more in, working in triple sets and doing a trap bar deadlift with a hamstring lower or some sort of PRI drill to keep that, kind of moving forward? Where do you kind of plug in some of these extra mobility pieces?
Yeah, I really like that question. Side note, big pet peeve of mine is when somebody says good question in response to every question. So I've intentionally over the course of the last few years, I've tried to be aware of that.
Saying well said, a lot of good
Yeah,
points. I have the
yeah,
same.
yeah, right. It's but I like that question because it's a little, it gets me thinking a little bit outside the box, right? I get kind of stuck isn't the right word. I'll use the word stuck until I come up with something better. But I get ingrained in my patterns
Yep.
in terms of how I design a training program and how I do warm-ups and so on. So I try to break out of that as I can, and every year being slightly different and my role changing over the course of time has got me thinking a little outside the box and what I might be normally accustomed to. So I'll talk a little bit about the last kind of 2 or 3 years
Yes.
being more involved in the gym pre-practice.
Yep.
I've started to incorporate a variety of different mobility drills. So to me, I think some areas that are important that are often neglected and kind of specifically if you talk about bar specialists and that overhead position, I think thoracic extension, being able to move really segmentally move the spine, flex and extend the lumbar spine, thoracic spine, and cervical spine. Being able to do that intentionally and break that down versus kind of being a stiff, rigid, I don't know, one stiff segment. Yeah, right. Crowbar. That's a good phrase. I think it's important to be able to segmentally um, flex and extend the lumbar spine, the thoracic spine, and the cervical spine. But specifically, I think thoracic spine is an area that we've tried to address and hammer home that there's a ton of different mobility drills you can do to improve thoracic extension. And if
Yep.
we can improve that and address that and make that a point of emphasis for somebody that tends to be a little bit more stiff through the thorax and therefore at the shoulder, especially on bars well, we're talking about gymnastics, so I won't even get into baseball, softball. But if we can address that and improve that, I think it goes a long way in helping keep them healthy for a longer amount of time versus, well, okay, they started experiencing pain. Now we have to address the pain. If we can be more proactive versus reactive, and that's in this example is specific to right thoracic extension, but I think in gross terms, in a broad sense, it's what I view my role as. If I can be proactive in improving areas that I know could potentially be a problem for gymnasts as a whole, and then specific individuals that might have a history of whatever their history is, whether it's shoulder related, elbow related, low back related, or a combination thereof, if you're really lucky. Um, it's it's something that I think goes a long way in improving their durability and their availability, right? There's I'm bad at phrases and analogies and all that, but I think there's a phrase that the best ability is durability or availability.
Yep.
I'm like, oh, okay, that's actually a pretty darn good point.
Mm.
But so for me, it's sorry, losing my train of thought. Focus, lock in. Uh, as I look at addressing mobility, I think there's some areas that are really important for gymnasts. I think that thoracic extension, I think thoracic rotation is also really important. I think the ability, I talked about this earlier, and this is something I borrow from DNS, but being able to break that extension compression stabilization strategy where they get stuck in this lordotic or lumbar extended position and they can't break out of that.
Yeah.
Um, and
Passive stability.
yeah, right. It's and that impacts you up and down the chain too, right? We know that every action has an equal opposite reaction. Whatever phrase you want to use, it's not just isolated to that one area. It's going to have an impact. Thoracic will have an impact at the shoulder. Low back will have an impact at the hips and down the chain, right? So if we can address that and get them to move, generally speaking, move better and
Mm.
understand how to move and what's going on, I think that improves their chances of staying healthier longer. So I've tried to hammer that home a lot in the last few years in pre-practice warm-ups when I'm in there, in between sets, as a way to, in some ways, as a way to build in some rest,
Yep.
necessarily so, but also in squatting, especially with the amount of uh, uh, individuals we've had with poor ankle mobility. I'll incorporate some ankle mobility drills either just prior to or actually intraset with a back squat or a front squat or squat variation to try and improve the quality of the specific exercise that we're doing, while also addressing that ankle mobility just generally because it's probably pretty awful
Yep.
in a lot of gymnasts, right? Not uncommon. Um, I think other areas that I look at, I've started to do a lot more hip mobility. I think about hip internal rotation. This is an area that I need to, it is it's an area of improvement that I've tried to make, that I need to continue to make, but it's understanding the importance of internal rotation at the hip and addressing that. And that's both wrapping the pelvis around the femur and rapid and moving the femur within the pelvis.
Yep.
Right. So I think addressing hip mobility, internal external rotation, both loaded or in a closed chain position and an open chain, both have their reasons and their timing. But I think both are important. So I think a lot about
Mm.
those concepts and incorporating them and offering them as frequently as possible, even if it's in really small doses and
Yeah.
maybe it takes 3 to 5 minutes of a session. But over the course of 4 or 5 sessions a week, if I'm averaging 15 total minutes to address mobility in some way, shape, or form, over the course of 40 plus weeks that I see them pretty consistently, that
Yeah.
starts to add up over time, right? So it's small in and of itself. 3 minutes, not going to do much by itself. 3 minutes, day after day after day after week after month after year and so on, I think goes a long way. And it teaches them what works for them.
Mm.
That's one of my favorite things that I see. I'll work with the team really consistently up until season. Once season hits, like I said, it backs off a little bit, but I'll still work with them in varying capacities depending on the year. But I try to be at meets as much as I can if I can travel, although travel is a weird concept nowadays.
Yeah.
But if I can get on the road with the team, or if I can just be at meets, my role there is to support them and to be a positive calming force, because sometimes you just need that.
Yeah.
But watching them do a dynamic warm up when I'm not there, when I'm not leading it, whether it's a pre practice one that I happen to pop in for or pre meet, and I see them doing some drills that I'm pretty confident they didn't know until they got here,
Mm.
that I offered to them. I'm like, man, they're doing a little bit extra for themselves because they know they like a shin box shift, or they know they like this QL stretch, or they know they like this extreme lunge variation.
Yep.
There's individuals that start to know that they like certain things,
Yep.
and that's a sign to me that they're taking ownership of their development, that I'm making an impact beyond just the hour a day that I might get them 3 or 4 times a week, right? That's where I start to uh, I find rewarding,
Mm.
and I find it to be the reason that I keep showing up day after day over the last dozen or so years.
Yeah. Awesome, man. I think that's a great explanation of kind of what we went through. And I think it's a really good, important gem or nugget, whatever you would say, to call out. My pet peeve is knowledge bombs. I hate that term. So I don't use that. But I think there's a really important kind of multi-layered comparison here between gymnastics specific stuff and then what every athlete should have the capacity to do. And I think one example that you talked about is super important is like thoracic spine, right? Like there's a very gymnastic specific, really rounded flex thoracic spine motion for bar working or for tumbling, which you should be able to do well and master in gymnastics, but you should also be able to extend and rotate fully, right? You shouldn't rob Peter to pay Paul, as they say. And there's a couple of examples that stick out. One is gymnastic specific bounding versus jumping and landing bounding, right? So that very stiff knee, very quick twitch off the spring floor for like front lay, or 1.5 punch lay, or very stiff off a double layout takeout, that you should know, understand, master, but you should also learn how to land like a general athlete, which is safely with hip hinge or squat pattern hybrid, whatever you would say, feet hip width apart. You should know the difference of those two skills and pull them out. Another one that's also very important too is like the gymnastics specific straight arm opening and closing you see on vault and on bars versus the general strength conditioning, horizontal pushing and pulling, that or vertical pushing, vertical pulling, right? Like you should know and train both. But then it also comes out to a global level, which is like just sport specific preparation of being in the gym and training and doing your skills. And then the role of general adaptations and general GPP conditioning, like in the off season, which is maybe more of the dominance, and then it kind of leaks its way down. And the best example of this is anaerobic conditioning. I think that it's really important in my book, and I've tried to really like, die on this pedestal, is you should have a 4-week block of general anaerobic training before you expose someone to half sets, to skill combinations, to full sets, because if you don't prep and prepare that energy system for the work that's coming, to learn how to be really fatigued under acidity and high load of hydrogen ions or whatever it is, and then you ask someone to just start doing tumbling passes, like, you are asking for a disaster. So I love the concept of, and I got this from Chris, of using GPP circuits, sleds, pushes, whatever you want to do, but give yourself 6 weeks in the end of the season to the start of the preseason to really give your athlete the potential to work in that window, and then kind of fine tune it into an actual anaerobic push, because so many athletes get hurt on their last tumbling pass. They land short and destroy their ankle, right? And so I think that's really important for people to kind of, if that was foreign to you, what I just said, like, go listen to the podcast with Chris Hinshaw or go research that, because there's a huge potential for performance and injury risk reduction with that.
Yeah, it's gas in the tank, right? I want them to have so much gas in the tank that they finish a flow routine and they feel they're jacked up, right? Their heart rate's up, blood lactate levels are high. No question about it. There's fatigue, and I can get that. And I appreciate that, but I want somebody that's still jazzed up and still juiced up and still's got a little bit something left, rather than somebody that's just dying,
Yeah.
that's hanging on for dear life, and they're just chucking that last pass, hoping that they land on their feet and hoping that they don't mess themselves up, right? It's and I've had kids over the course of my career now, you start to build relationships with student athletes, and as we've tweaked the program over the course of my time, especially upperclassmen, if we make a tweak and we're training less aggressively in season or leading up to the season, the few weeks or months prior, they might see the difference and they might seek me out. Again, going back to what I talked about with warm up and doing some individual work, things that make them feel good. I've had student athletes seek me out in December and January, wanting to do a little additional strength training, once or twice a week. They say they just feel really good after they squat and after the RDL.
Yep.
And I say, well, let's pump the brakes. Let's take a second. I hear you, and I'm all about it. Let's have a rational, level-headed conversation on what days make sense, what type of loading makes sense, how you're going to handle that to make sure that you're not putting yourself in a compromised position in training, and understand that the long-term goal is to get them feeling really good as the season progresses and as we enter postseason, feeling ready to knock out those really hard skills that they might be building towards, especially if they're coming off an injury or if they've had some sort of extended time off for whatever reason. So those are areas for me that I think, again, I said I find it rewarding and value, but it's student athletes and young women taking their own training and their own development into their hands. It shows a high level intrinsic motivation, and it shows an area that I think they can continue to instill in their teammates, especially if they still have some time after that specific year. If they're a sophomore or junior, if we can take advantage of that, and I can use them as an example and help them use them as a means of driving the ship and driving my message. I think it goes a long way for creating long-term sustained success programmatically.
Yeah, for sure. And I think something you said that was super important I want to highlight is another big selling point for definitely college programs, but especially clubs, which is where I want to steer this conversation next about how we get this change to happen at the lower levels. Is you're using, and we talked about this on our private conversation, and I said it in the last podcast, but like stop thinking about gymnasts as glass cannons, which is like this tiny, fragile, breakable thing that if you squat or you hinge, you're gonna break and fracture. And like, yes, if you're an unaware, you're lacking self-awareness as a strength coach and you're putting a football program on gymnasts, like, yeah, that's a problem. You should definitely check yourself, right? Don't put the GA assistant just in the program and be like, all right, you guys go do your thing, right? But that being said, if you have a level-headed program and you're doing good coaching and stuff, is they're not glass cannons that you're going to break. They're anti-fragile is the term that's really popular in the S&C world. Is like they're going to get stronger and more adaptation, and they're going to be stronger from the stress, the proper dosage of stress you put on them, followed by the proper dosage of recovery. And what we're trying to do here, and I like this from what Mike, my boss, did with the Red Sox, is he was convincing people like there's a sand hourglass. A season starts, the sand starts to trickle, right? And that's going to be inevitable, right? So what we're trying to do with strength conditioning is put more sand in the hourglass, higher capacity. We know that VO2 max and fitness levels and high chronic workloads are correlated with less injury risk and better performance as of the stats we know right now. So we're trying to put more sand in your team's hourglass to get through that long grind of season and make it to nationals and regionals and nationals and be better. And then the role of good coaching, good communication, good medical care, good strength conditioning, tweaking, good volume is like letting the sand come through that hourglass slower. Let's reduce the pinch bottleneck. So now we're kind of manipulating the equation at both times, but inevitably it's going to go down. And I think when you drive that performance conversation, people really buy in. So I encourage people to have that mindset of what can we do to build your capacity, not what can we do to keep you from getting hurt in the weight room, you know?
Yeah, right. It's reframing. I think it's reframing the relationship to non-gymnastics, more generalized training, reshaping that to as a means of, like you said, putting more glass or excuse me, putting more sand in the hourglass, building a more robust uh, uh, pool of energy and um, I talk a lot about gas in the tank.
Yeah.
Just filling up your gas tank so that you can hit the gas and not be worried about running out and not be worried about finding yourself on that E. I think that's where that recovery piece. I talk about recovery a lot, and this is something you just kind of talked about recovery as well. So I'm gonna get on my tangent here.
Sure, man.
Uh,
Fire away.
I think there's a time and a place for specific recovery-based modalities. So some examples might be Normatec or just compression tire, compression sleeves. I think massage, cold tubs, hot tubs, foam rollers, vibrating foam rollers, a cross ball, all these different tools and modalities of that are more passive, right? In a lot of ways, they're more passive modes. I think have their time and place, especially as you get deep into the season and you're looking for every bit of competitive advantage.
Yep.
But what can you do aside from that? I'll call it a 5 to 6 week window for us, right? Uh, Big Ten championships, week off, regionals, week off, nationals, 5 week period, and I'll take the week prior to Big Ten, so 6 weeks.
Mhm.
Aside from that 6 weeks where you're trying to find every little bit of advantage, what can you do for the other 40 something weeks of the year to make sure that you're as prepared as possible so that you can take advantage of those um, of the benefits of those different modalities, and that's good sleep. It's good quality sleep and the appropriate amount, not 3 hours during the week and then 12 hours on Saturday and Sunday. It's good nutritional habits and understanding how nutrition impacts performance and how it's fuel for performance and building a healthy relationship around it. It's good strength development through full ranges of motion, both anterior and posteriorly, from a really general standpoint. It's good energy system development. It's good understanding of coaches, and that's strength coaches and gymnastics coaches, on how to vary volumes and intensity. So it's not always high volume, always high intensity. Burn the candle from both ends, and hope that it sticks and that people stay healthy enough, and so that you can duct tape them at the end of the season. But can you create an actual periodized structure of 2 or 3 weeks that are pretty hard and aggressive,
Mm.
back down for a week in terms of that total volume and a little bit in intensity, and then start to ramp back up. Or even within the week, can you have some hard days and easy days? Understanding that, again, it doesn't all need to be just hard. It doesn't all need to just be fatiguing. And
Yep.
it's not about feeling good and being able to do full routines in November. Who who cares, right? If you're at your best in November, if you're at your best in November, I've failed you. Coaches have failed you. Your coaches, your strength coaches, the people around you have failed you. If you're at your best, if everyone's at their best in November, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be in a good spot in November and shouldn't be feeling good, but I'd rather have to pull the reins back and say, you look great, but there's no need to go over the top and go overboard. you have this. Let's continue to kind of slow cook this and bring it to a slow boil versus, well, let's start boiling and hoping the pot doesn't come dry and run dry come March and April. And so you can use whatever phrase and whatever thought process and approach you want. But at the end of the day, it's our responsibility as strength coaches and as sport coaches to provide a service that helps protect student athletes and athletes that we work with from running themselves into the ground and setting themselves up for failure during the most important times of the year when we know that they're going to do everything they can to be available and potentially putting them at risk for catastrophic injuries to occur.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely, man. And this popped into my mind because this came up in a discussion today. We're talking a lot about trying to change the number of hours that somebody does when they're younger and things of that nature. And there's a lot of people who are like, yeah, but my athlete, and this happens in the college setting, is like, yeah, but like my athletes are just trying to they always want to be in the gym. They always want to train more. They're trying to push themselves. They're trying to get the most out of it. And then one parent waiting goes, yeah, if it was up to my kid, though, they would eat ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and they would never do anything besides that. So it's our job as adults or parents or as mentors to say, hey, you can't be in the gym 20 hours a week when you're 12. Maybe that's not appropriate, right? Or in your guys' case, like, hey, more bar routines or more strength or more like, studying, whatever you're doing is probably not going to be effective. Like, you need to actually go pull back. Optimal dose of stress followed by optimal dose of recovery is how we're going to maximize your potential. And I love what you said with being able to pull back and kind of find the balance of capacity to regeneration, because we can think about this on a minute all the way up through it. And this is periodization, like 101, but like from a local, standpoint of energy systems and capacity, if you're fitter and you're doing more capacity work, you put more sand in your hourglass before, you're going to recover faster between turns. You can maintain a higher level of power output with repeat sprintability is like the soccer term, but gymnastics is repeat sprintability, training just whole body, right? So there's a localized one, but then we have for a routine, you're going to have to, do your high anaerobic window, and then you're going to have to rush over to your next event and start warming up. Like, well, that's the aerobic system. That's fitness. That's capacity. That's sand in the hourglass, right? Then we have the day-to-day. Can you recover between day one of regionals and day two, between your first practice and your second, right? That's the exact same we're talking about on a global level of recovery. And then, like you mentioned so well, is the longer-term periodization, right? Like the concepts of 3 to 4 weeks on and a 1 week deload, right? The concept of a month, 2 month cycle and pulling back into a preseason, in season, or sorry, an off season, preseason, in season A, and an in season B with championships. Like, this is basics of periodization that I feel the gymnastics world still struggles with, but like more is not always better, right? Oftentimes, I would say 80% of the time, more efficient and less is better, right? Slightly less hours, but more efficiency. Turn the light switch on. Let's go hard for these 2.5 hours, 3 hours, whatever it is. And then let's go real hard on our recovery, right? Let's stress management. Let's do our good nutrition practice. Let's educate you and all that kind of stuff. Like, there's way more potential on the optimal dose theory than it is the more theory.
Yeah. More isn't better. Better is better.
Yep.
It's the truth. There's some times selectively throughout the year where more is might be the objective, but I'd say majority of the year should not be geared around just go 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 go. And it's difficult. It's difficult. Inherently, we want it. We want it for them. Trying harder, and this is in gymnastics, but it covers a lot of different areas in sport and in life. Just trying harder in and of itself often isn't going to help resolve whatever the issue is, whether it's lack of aerobic or anaerobic fitness, whether it's lack of strength or mobility or flexibility. Just trying harder might not resolve that, but intentionally being purposeful and intentional in what you're doing will go a long way versus just trying harder and straining harder. I use this example a lot with running. I think it's the easiest thing for any person to just visually see. If you look at some of the best runners and sprinters in the world, they're smooth. They're smooth not only on the lower half, but especially the upper half. Their face is generally relaxed. Their neck and shoulders are relaxed. They're swinging freely from the shoulder in this front to back versus side to side motion, and they're not trying harder. We see that's it's funny and I like to point it out as much as I can, because if you can get somebody to just be a little bit more fluid and relaxed, it's less energy. It's less energy for them to move at the same rate, if not faster,
Mhm.
with less fatigue that accumulates. And that could be gymnastics wise, that could be on a bar routine or certainly on floor. If they can just find a way to relax a little bit instead of just trying harder, gritting their teeth and trying to gut it out, relax a little bit. Find a way to take that few seconds you might have in between with, like you talked about, with choreography and some of the dance and leap series that are a little less stressful. If you
Mm.
can find a way to bring yourself down and just take that extra breath and moment to stay relaxed and to find some of that relaxation, especially through the neck, face, and shoulders, I think that helps you just take that deeper breath and set yourself up for that last pass, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some of that, I again, I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but I talk a lot about this with our team, and I have over the course of many years now. The skills that I try to help them develop go a long way for them, I believe, not only in the gym and in training and competition, but it covers a lot of their life, right? And I think if you take a step back and you let yourself look and self-reflect at what you're going through as a student athlete, I think that you find yourself more prepared to handle the stressors of life than you probably give yourself credit for. And this is definitely a big tangent, but it's really really true, right? It's the work and the effort and the commitment that gymnasts put in, and it's a lot of athletes, but specifically gymnasts right now, that they put into their training and their preparation to be at their best for us at Big Tens, regionals, and nationals. Those are skills that employers look for. That's what law schools look for. That's what businesses look for. It's what you look for in somebody that's trying to start their own small business, whether it's a gym or a restaurant or what have you. It's those traits and those skills that I'm looking to help them develop and recognize, along with everyone else in our lanes, our coaches, at least our athletic trainer, our dietitians, our athletic counseling team, our career center on campus, our Michigan Athletics Career Center. It's all of those entities and set them up for success and get them to realize that what they're experiencing as student athletes prepares them for life beyond athletics in more ways that they can probably immediately recognize because they're just kind of blinders on. It creates a better relationship between myself and them, between all those other units, and it creates a better, more healthy relationship with them and their experience with the sport, their experience with diet and nutrition, their experience with exercise, their experience with partners and friends and coaches. We don't live in silos. It's impossible to live in a silo, and I
Yep.
think it's irresponsible us to think that we do, and that we as adult figures and authority figures uh, only impact them in the one specific area that our roles entail. That's not the case, and I think if we've learned anything about sport and about gymnastics and the way it's been, it doesn't need to be that way. It doesn't need to be the way it's been moving forward,
Yep.
and I think it's changing, and I look forward to continuing being part of that change and creating a more healthy dynamic and relationship
Yep.
with student athletes and their relationship to the sport and to authority figures as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny you say that, and I love kind of what you're pointing at now is like the sport as a tool to teach life lessons and really give you the tools you need to be successful. And I think there's two examples that I really like. One being, I'm often saying in our energy systems training that is very hard, especially when we have 8, 9, 10 rounds. I'm always saying don't hit the panic button, right? That's like my biggest cue. I think really what obviously you get physiological adaptations, but we're teaching a lot of mental skills through strength conditioning and through gymnastics in general is, how can you find calm in the chaos? I think that's a really important concept for a lot of gymnasts to master of whether we're talking about on your 7th repeat sprint out of 10, where you're like, oh, yeah, I'd rather not do 3 more of these. Like, what are you saying to yourself in your head to drive calm, right? To keep yourself controlled, because maybe we're talking about keeping vagal tone and parasympathetic, whatever, that geeky stuff, or it's more just like what you say between your ears and your head is going to dictate if you're going to get through this completely. And if you trust your training, you've done the work, and if you put the work in now, it's going to translate when you're on the big stage and you're dancing into your 3rd pass and you're like, I'm dying right now. I feel like I'm going to die right now, but don't hit the panic button. And I'm always kind of repeating that. And I think that applies really well to life as well. especially the concept which has become an arc of my life, which is finding calm in the chaos no matter what. And there's not more of a time that it's appropriate that I'm trying to teach the athletes that life lesson than right now. Middle of COVID, crazy stuff going on in gymnastics with athlete A. The culture is changing. We're finding out some things that are very uncomfortable, right? But you have to be able to do something in your daily life or in your strategies of mental health to find calm, right? Whether that's journaling, whether that's social skills, whether that's exercising, whatever it is. And I think teaching those athletes using gymnastics as a vessel to teach that, especially when things are really, really hard, like right now in coronavirus return, like that's what's going to stick with them when they leave the sport. And I think that's why I'm still coaching. I'm sure that's why most people are still doing it. We're not doing it because we care about, the scores are the only thing. And like, yeah, winning national championships are awesome. And I want kids to get scholarships and I want the elite team to go on the Olympic team and dominate on the world stage. But it's going to end and we're going to have a set of life skills. And whether we look back and we're proud of the decisions that we made for teaching the right skills, or we only looked at gymnasts and not humans, is going to rest on our plate. And regret is poisonous. Regret is one of the worst things you can live with. So every choice you make has to have that lens behind it.
Yeah. I think you touched on some really powerful and impactful points there. It's I think it's important to take a step back and self-reflect. You said journal earlier. That's why I like exercise. I like exercise myself personally because it's my time to do something I enjoy and disconnect from what my job is. Although my job in a lot of ways is based around exercise. It's also my hobby. It's my chance to take a step back and to give myself time to just process my day, process my week, process the current state of my world, if you will. And I think it's important that we find our ways to handle stress and to live understanding that chaos is going to occur and that you shouldn't hit the panic. Don't hit the panic. Find a way to bring yourself down. And I think there's some other things that we do in training to address that. We'll do some diaphragmatic breathing and some addressing that vagal tone, especially post training. Hard training session. They're gassed at the end of it. Maybe it's a hard Tabata circuit. Maybe some med ball slams and I don't know slider mountain climbers or maybe it's a fan bike or what have you. Well, okay, let's bring yourself down. Let's do some drill work that actually brings you down and set you up for success for recovering from the session as you move into your next training session, either later that day, whether it's in the gym or the next day or whatever the case is. So it's what's funny. I got in the profession and I got into it because I like I said earlier, I found value in training. I found value in the physical preparation for myself, and I thought I could be a resource for other athletes that could benefit from the services of strength and conditioning. And that's why I got into it. And I've stayed in it because of the people. I get to do something I really enjoy and something I love day in day out. Understanding that uh, my goal and my objective is to create a lasting impact. And sure, it's through the physical development, but like I said, it carries over to other areas of their life, and I find a connection with the people I work with, and that's colleagues, it's coworkers, it's um, interns and young coaches that I connect with. It's people like yourself. It's the student athletes. It's those people that really kind of fill me up and fill up my hourglass that you talked about. That gets drained over the course of time, but it's filled up more and more by these conversations. I don't know that our favorite thing in the world necessarily is sitting around at 9 o'clock at night having this conversation and you're going to go cut this tape and this part might not make it and you're going to spend the time doing it. And why? Because I hope that the conversation filled you up and leaves you energized and excited about the fact that you have the opportunity, the same way that I do and a lot of other coaches, to go out and impact the lives of young people that put their trust in you to help their development, not only in the sport but in their lives, right? And it's not something we can ever take lightly. And I think uh, more people like you and I, not to toot our horns and to blow smoke of each of our blow smoke. Um, I think it's really important that we continue to do the work we're doing and to be good stewards of the time that we get with the athletes that we work with and bring up the level of the sport from a positivity standpoint and shift that culture and dynamic.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of surmounting to a really good place to kind of wrap this up a little bit is I think the most unique thing about gymnastics more than many other sports, and I guess of course I'm biased, but
Yeah.
gymnastics has one of the most unique relationships with fear that's available in a sporting arena. And I think that's why it's such a powerful vessel for life, because gymnastics is terrifying, man. If you're doing it, especially at a high level, like you're working with the people that you are. And I think it really gives you an opportunity to learn the healthy coping skills to deal with fear and also to deal with discomfort. And in many people's lives, being able to microdose yourself with those fear moments or those discomforts is what allows you to adapt and become stronger. And I think that's really why I'm still involved in the sport is my experience with being able to deal with physical discomfort of a bike sprint or of whatever it else, but more so is emotional discomfort and that kind of stuff with hard conversations and trying to impact the people in a positive way. I think that's what's happening right now. And the change in gymnastics is we're realizing that it's going to be hard, man. It's going to be really hard to turn this boat in the right direction and keep doing it. But there's the ability to use the skills we've learned from gymnastics about, oh, this is the same feeling I feel when I'm in front of the 6,000 people at a big meet or whatever it is, and also a new skill or where this bike sprint that's going to feel terrible. The ability to have teammates and social support and role models and mentors like yourselves who can help you get through that and learn those skills, that's what people take with them into their life. And I truly believe that the reason that I'm in gymnastics still is because I think there's people that if we give them the right pathway and the right skills, they're going to become so passionate about a certain subject it's going to change the world. Like someone, I think some gymnast around the world is going to go through a program the right way and they're going to cure cancer because they developed the mental fortitude and the commitment and the passion and the ability to deal with hard things that they're going to go on and do something incredible. So like I envision that in the future. And I think that's what people should connect to in terms of like, why am I still doing this? Why am I still putting in so much work? Why don't I just leave gymnastics and abandon everybody when this place is so jacked up that it's not worth changing? Like, yes, it is, because it's the most incredible vessel we have to dance with fear.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I talked earlier about the class of 14, and that was an impactful class for me. And there's been a lot of impactful young women, young student athletes that have matured into to grown women that I get to see, and it's uh it's humbling when I get a random text message of
Mhm.
from Nicole Arts and Talia Shirelli. We have a group text that we'll randomly text each other, just finish a workout, and it might be a picture of a treadmill or a snapshot of the Apple Watch workout. Or Rima Zechariah, like I mentioned, is somebody that figured it out during her time. She didn't have an easy path to Michigan and through Michigan, but she figured it out, and now she's a fitness professional herself out in California. Right? It's moments like that. It's seeing people evolve over the course of their time as 18, 17, or 18-year-old women, and leaving here being successful and ready to conquer whatever comes their way. It's that case with a lot of different sports and a lot of student athletes. I mentioned it earlier. I go to meets, and I think one of the benefits of not having been a gymnast and not having been a softball player and not having played field hockey or soccer or other sports that I've worked with previously is that I generally know good from bad, like good performance from bad performance. But I'm also kind of ignorant enough to realize that, or to be aware that I don't know. I can't tell if somebody had a bad warm up or a bad turn, or if I think that that's going to ruin their chances of having a successful performance on whatever the event or rotation is. I can just be kind of an ignorant calming force in some ways, which I kind of enjoy, and it's been the case in gymnastics and the softball, and like I said, a lot of other sports. I, sure I want them to be successful, and I want to compete for championships, and I want to win. We all do,
Yep.
but I hope that the people that I work with day in and day out get that. Um, at the end of the day, that's not the most important thing. And if they do well, that's awesome. I'm gonna be really jacked up for them. And if they literally fall on their backside, I'm gonna do everything I can to help pick them up. And it goes a long way. And I think improving relationships and like I said, it's what energizes and motivates me every day to show up to do what I do. And reflecting and reminiscing gives me some really positive vibes, especially in a time that isn't necessarily positive in the world. It's refreshing to see and to see in my mind and think about it. And I think when we finish up, I'm going to send out a couple texts because it's got my brain thinking and appreciating the people that uh, have helped me be successful in my role.
Yeah, man, absolutely. And I'm sure those people are equally as grateful, and I'm sure they have amazing words to say about you. But I feel you, me, I mean, there's so many other great people that we could name on this list. I'm very fortunate to work with a lot of NCAA teams now, and there's people in the woodwork, head down, doing the right thing by athletes every day, and they are making such a positive ripple effect on the lives of the athletes they work with. And all of this negative noise, which don't get me wrong, needs to be highlighted and said, there's people like yourself and there's people like that I know, like Nick Rudd and everybody else who are, I think they really question why they're still doing it sometimes. It's like, man, this is hard. Like, to be a good human in our sport and do the right thing and fight uphill against the curve right now, especially after 20 years of our culture, is really hard. And I think it's exhausting and I think it's tiring, especially when maybe the credit or the attention isn't put on you deserve. But like, that's what keeps me going too, is like realizing the potential to make such a big impact on history and be a good person is amazing to me. And I take it for granted sometimes. And I think I need to be better about that. But at the same time, like, if everybody can take it upon themselves to do the right thing by the athletes every day, treat them well, and keep growing, keep talking, keep learning. Don't, like, let's throw out the old model and build something new and build something that we're all proud of and something that we're happy to be a part of. We're going to look back on this in 10, 20 years and be like, that was the reason. We were the catalyst because we were willing to suck up the emotional weight of what we did wrong, and we could stand up and keep moving forward. And I think the next generation of athletes, the four athletes that you mentioned in 2014, or maybe the class of whatever you have in 5 years, some of them are going to be gymnastics coaches who we're going to leave and we're not going to put their kids in gymnastics, but because they interacted with you and had such a good experience, or you and the team or whatever, they put their kid in gymnastics, or they took on a gym and they went back and they were like, no, there's a better way to do this. And we care about our athletes, and we're going to stand up to this minority of people who are treating kids like garbage and are inappropriate. And I think that's the only way we're going to get out of this mess, is from individuals depending on and supporting other individuals to do the right thing every day.
Yeah, I certainly I couldn't say it any better. You hit the
Yeah.
nail on the head with that.
Cool, man. Well, let's end it on this. I think we've done a really great job of sharing some education that people need, but I think most people are, how do we get this in the club level? So what is your advice on what the 10 to 18-year-old club level people can do, and your advice for maybe, that everyone is now going to want their own Lew. Everybody wants their own Lew in their gym now after this amazing talk and all the knowledge you've given. So what advice do people have, and we'll kind of end on that.
Yeah, I think for me, we talked at uh, a fairly high level on some different topics. Um, don't let perfection get in the way of greatness, or good enough in some ways, right? And that's what I mean by that, is that you don't have to do everything perfect to a T, but I think being basic, starting basic, and teaching good fundamentals and good movement quality that might not necessarily be gymnastics specific, quote unquote, that will impact positively gymnasts in terms of their preparation and helping to be more durable and withstand injury,
Mhm.
I think goes a long way. And that's the simplicity side of those kind of five buckets of movements that I discussed earlier, addressing good squatting, good hip hinging, good bracing mechanics, pressing and pulling, and understanding that those movements might look a little bit different than you would instruct them or teach them relative to gymnastic specific skills, but that developing those movements and strength in the muscle groups that help landing positions, that help takeoff positions, that help the positions that are specific to gymnastics, it will go a long way in improving their ability to get out day in and day out and do what you're asking them to do, and for them to have higher quality skills.
Yep.
So it's basics and it's quality over quantity, and it's understanding that there needs to be ebbs and flows in training. It can't just be one meteoric rise. At some point, you're gonna set them up for failure versus setting out for success. And keep in mind that it's incremental, and the longer that they can stay in the sport, the greater the likelihood for success is.
Yep.
You don't need to be the best you'll ever be at 10, 11, 12. If you are, then something's gone wrong, and they're probably going to find themselves more often than not burnt out,
Yep.
whether it's physically, emotionally, or some combination thereof.
Yep.
So it's stick with the basics. Don't be afraid to back off over the course of the year, and do that strategically at times that make sense.
Yep.
And don't be afraid of a little bit of time just away from the gym.
Yeah.
it goes a long way. And if COVID-19 has taught us anything in being out of the gym, and how quickly a lot of student athletes and a lot of younger athletes will bounce back and find themselves picking up skills that they left off with, or pretty close to, and then surpassing where they were.
Mm,
uh, it teaches us that maybe some time away is a good thing to decompress, and gets them energized and motivated to get back in the gym and put forth better quality movement with more purpose and intent.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, man. I love it. Well, personally for me, I thank you for all you're doing and being such a positive example, because a lot of the club level is looking up to the Michigans of the world, to what to do and trickle down in a past 20 years where we haven't had the best leadership in terms of training philosophies and what to do. I think a lot of people are shifting their eyesight towards the NCAA world as models for what can we do at the club level. So I thank you deeply, and I really look forward to the start of many of these conversations with you and I working together. So looking forward to it, man.
Yeah, likewise. I appreciate you taking some time to listen to me, and uh, I give you credit because I hate listening to my own voice, and you've had to deal with it for the last however long we've been on this. So I certainly appreciate the time and your willingness to respond to somebody that just reached out of the blue. As um,
Yeah, it's a Twitter DM. I forgot
yeah,
about that.
yeah, and I think I mentioned it previously, but myself and Lisa and our staff have admired the work that you've done the last few years, and
Thank you.
it just made sense to take advantage of the fact that you're so willing and open to having conversations, and really sharing information and knowledge and learning from each other. Um, it goes a long way, and it says a lot about you, and it gives me hope for the future of gymnastics as a whole. Right?
I appreciate that, man. That means a lot. Yeah, I'm grateful to have the platform, and I'm just a nerd trying to help people out, man.
Yeah, I hear that.
All right, dude. Well, we'll get this chopped up. This is probably going to go out in a couple of weeks, so I'm looking forward to everyone hearing this.
Yeah, no question. Is there anything else you need from me at all?
Nope. It's great, buddy.
Awesome.